Hello and welcome to the Week 18 edition of the Base on Balls podcast. I am Cody. I'm joined tonight by Paul and Connor. Paul and Connor, how are you guys doing tonight?
Doing good. Staying alive after my win against Bracton last week. But an interesting week overall. I know that it's going to be probably a bit of a shorter podcast because we don't have any trades to talk about. But doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of interesting stuff that happened this past week.
Absolutely. And Connor, how are you doing tonight?
I'm very optimistic about my team's direction. Obviously, I'm disappointed that we can't analyze some trades, but I guess in the waiver wire acquisitions aren't going to cut it. But definitely a lot of good matchups and huge playoff ramifications that I look forward to discussing with y'all.
Absolutely. And Connor, why don't we just jump right into your matchup? The Amarillo Sod Poodles take down the Kannapolis Cannonballers 6-17 to 5-12. Connor, I know you got to be feeling good breaking 600. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the first time you've broken 600 in at least quite some time. How are you feeling about last week's performance?
I feel very good. I think it's the first time I've eclipsed 600 in a standard week since maybe week 2. And this is kind of the model for how the best case for my team. It's no secret that I'm lacking in pitching, and 123 points normally wouldn't cut it. But my bats literally scored the most out of any team this week. And I did some strategic buying during the trade deadline, and I think they all paid off pretty well. Jeremy Pena with 27 points and 15 at-bats. Josh Bell and Jeff McNeil combined for 106. Cabrian Hayes had a terrific week as well with 73. Nick Castellanos with 66. So I'm not going to pretend like I'm going to be a contender next year, but I do like to see my players perform well and either give people a run to start the season or just increase their trade value from when I got them.
Absolutely. And Paul, what did you see in this matchup?
Yeah, so I said it last week when we were talking about the trade deadline that Connor really had a really good trade deadline. And he got some really good players, specifically his bats were really good. Obviously, he mentioned it, 494 from just his bats, and it was the high mark for the league this week. When you have a guy like Castellanos, Brian Hayes, I mean, those two are guys that he got Sunday night last week at the trade deadline. So when you have two guys combined for 140 points, basically, that's a lot of points, and that's how you get over 600 points. And then as for Hamco and Kannapolis, tougher week. Neither his bats or his arms were in the 300s. So, maybe a little bit of a down week for Hamco, who's usually, up there scoring with the higher teams. But just a tough week, and it happens to every team. So, but Tanner Beebe, especially a 2-start week, 71 points, just a ton of points. But, when you have negative 28 from Adam Wainwright, negative 2 from Oviedo, his arms came back down to earth this week, and, it happens. So it's nothing to, cause for concern. Just stay the course with what he's doing, his rebuild, and he'll be fine.
Yeah, for me, and both of you guys touched on it. I mean, just absolutely impressive performance from Connor's bats. And he's right. And Paul, you are too. A lot of these guys are guys he's brought in recently. A lot of kind of under the radar players. Maybe it's not even recently that he's brought in, but guys like James Outman, Tommy Edman, Nick Castellanos, Bryce Terrain, Jeremy Pena, Cabrian Hayes. I think he got Jeff McNeil actually out of free agency. Has had a tough year and put up 52 points. Josh Bell with 54. I mean, just a complete offensive performance from the Sod Poodles. Who knows, the pitching's weak. That's obviously a much tougher hill to climb. But hey, when you get the bats settled, you can finally start focusing on gathering up some arms. And I believe that's what Connor's plans are. And for Homko, this is probably a little bit of the result of selling at the deadline, which he did a little bit of. The bats were decent at 290. I mean, you want to kind of be at that 300 mark and above. He was close. Of course, Tanner Bibby had a 2-start week, and both of them were impressive starts. But there's some pitching issues here as well that he's definitely working on through the farm system of bringing those guys up. So yeah, tough week for Homko. It's kind of been a tough season for Homko, but kudos to Connor. 617's got to feel good to be able to put one of those weeks up. And all in all, what's probably been somewhat of a disappointing season, but you always kind of want to finish on a high note and take that momentum into the off season. So we will now cut over to. I guess I probably should have started with this matchup, but it was clearly the matchup of the week. The Norfolk Tides take down Bracton's Larks 701 to 589. Paul, I will let you go first. I know it was a big win for you. How are you feeling after surviving?
Yeah, so it's a massive win for me, and it keeps me at least in the playoff hunt still. A loss would have knocked me out and given Bracton that 7th seed. And now with me winning, it kind of keeps things open, at least for this last week of the regular season. But obviously, what was for at least half the week a really horrible performance by my bats turned into at least decent with 319 total. Xander Bogaerts, who I got at the trade deadline with 42. Trevor Story, who has been on my injured list pretty much all year, came back this week and dropped 40, which is huge for me. But then it was all about the guys I got in these last couple weeks with Brandon Williamson, 2-star week, 68 points. Pablo Lopez, 83 points. Guys that I kind of identified as guys that I really need to get on the pitching side. And they balled out for me. 382 for my arms. That's probably one of the higher marks I've had all season. But then as for Bracton, obviously he was a buyer at the deadline as well. Unfortunately, a guy Reed Detmer's -23 really kind of put the matchup out of reach for him this week. I still like Reed Detmer's, obviously former Tide, but that's kind of what his deal is. Some weeks he'll get 30, 40 point pitching starts, and some weeks he'll go negative, and that's just kind of how it went for him this week. But obviously his bats are really solid, and I said that on the main chat this week that I really like how he rounded his bats out, and they're all young and they're all really talented. So, I mean, similar to Connor, I think Bracton's figured his bats out. Now he's just got to see what he can do with his pitching.
Yeah. One thing, well, I guess I got two things here, and I'll turn it over to Connor. The Pablo Lopez for Reed Detmer's swap that you made with me about a week and a half ago, maybe longer. Time's getting away from me. It was recent. And it wasn't just a 1-for-1 swap, but I want to mention this. I think this is important. You won this matchup by 112 points. The difference in owning Reed Detmer's last week and owning Pablo Lopez was 106 points. So if you had not made that trade, this matchup would have been a lot closer. I just find that really interesting. That's just, and of course, ultimately he ends up on Bracton's team, which actually helps you even more in that differential, because you would have scored 106 points less, and then he wouldn't have had Reed Detmer's. And yeah, but I just, the trade aspects, it makes things interesting. The second thing I'll point out is your pitching performance as a unit. 382 points. That's what you want to see every week from your arms. There was some talk around the league, and I wasn't on the podcast last week after the trade deadline, but I'll say there was some talk around the league that was, did Paul sell at the deadline? Was there some selling moves? I really don't think that's what you did. I think that you moved bats away to upgrade the pitching, and I think it showed this week. You ended up with 382 points from your arms. Your bats at 319. That's a complete performance. You end up at 701. I'm sure if it was up to you, you would do that every single week. So it was a good week for you. For Bracton, again, the bats are there. I think the bats are fine. But they kind of have been all year. I don't think there's ever been a time on any of these podcasts where we've talked about Bracton's team and we've said, he needs some offensive help. I think he's always had the offense. There's been a lot of movement in and out with these arms, and it's just not great. Bryce Elder, 1 point, Mackenzie Gore, -1 point, Tariq Skubal, -1 point. Nestor Cortez got hurt, never got any use out of him. Paul Blackburn was a guy he traded for at the deadline, -3. I do want to say that Andrew Abbott worked out. That was a good start, 33 points. But, yeah, the arms are definitely lacking here, and it's more of an inconsistency with these arms. He's got guys like Paul mentioned with Reed Detmers where, yeah, he's going to have 30-point starts, but he's going to have -30-point starts, and it's just kind of up and down. And those arms are definitely frustrating to own. But a good week for Paul. Congrats on surviving and making Week 19 a whole lot more interesting around here. Connor, I'll let you go. What did you see in this matchup?
I think Cody covered it really well. The difference between the arms. For a couple weeks, I've really pushed the narrative that Paul and Bracton had similar teams in that the offensive to pitching ratios were the same, and whoever would eclipse 300 points pitching more consistently would win this playoff matchup, and that is how it turned out to be. Bracton, for the entire season, has relied on younger players, and I do want to give the Larks credit. They had a massive losing streak after an identity change from the Blue Jays to the Larks, and Bracton pulled a 180, started buying, and made a really compelling playoff case. But the problem is that young arms are inconsistent. Reed Detmers with -23. Mackenzie Gore's -1 was against the Athletics. Those are very high highs and low lows. So I'm really curious as to how the Larks continue to update over the offseason. Will they try to retool a bit? I know Bracton's made massive strides from where his team was earlier in the year, but does he continue to try to buy? Does he sell? That might be one of the headlines of the offseason. Then Paul's team just outvalued them. More consistent older arms. Eduardo Rodriguez with 38. Pablo Lopez is 27 or 28, but he's been in the league for a few years with 83. Just more experienced arms took Paul over the edge, and I think as the clear 6 or 7 seed favorite for the playoffs, I'm really looking forward to see where this team goes.
Absolutely. And we will move on now to my matchup. The Bowling Green Hot Rods took down the El Paso Chihuahuas 889 to 676. I'll kind of go first, and I'll let you guys touch on if there's anything that you want to say. The teams I've mentioned on these podcasts all season long that I was looking for my team to kind of make just a complete performance for me to feel semi-comfortable as I move into the playoffs. And the last 2 weeks, I have no complaints with what my team has done. This week, my offense, 459 points. My pitching, 430 points. That's about as complete as you can get. Happy with some of the moves that I made recently to kind of get this team where I wanted it to be. Sonny Gray was probably an under-the-radar addition. Nobody probably thought much about that. He gets me 66 points in the first week I have him. Cal Bradish in one start got me 28 points. Sandy's back, 50-point performance. I got Kershaw back this week with an 18-point performance. And Logan Webb, of course, keeps doing his thing. So I'm definitely happy with my pitching. As far as my bats, man, they've kind of been a juggernaut lately, and almost a little concerned with that because the lights are going to go out eventually, and I just hope it's not during the playoffs. But Adley had a big first week for me. Pete Alonso has been otherworldly the last 2 or 3 weeks. He had a 79-point week. Austin Riley, 80 points. Wander Franco, which we'll get into a little bit later, with 62 points as tears fall down my face. But good. I'm proud of this performance. Proud of the team. I feel like the moves that I made at the deadline kind of have my team really balanced, really deep, really ready for the playoff push. We'll see what happens. For Smell, listen, this was a good performance from the Chihuahua. 676, 320 offensively, 356 from the arms. And my team just kind of played on fire all week. Paul, I'll turn it over to you. What did you see in this matchup?
Yeah, so Cody's offense followed his 20 home run performance against me 2 weeks ago with 18 home runs this week. So, I mean, Cody said it best. His team is just an absolute, at least his bats are just an absolute juggernaut right now. But like he said, can he continue that? That is going to be the question. And maybe we'll talk about the Wander Franco stuff after all this. But his arms obviously really good too. He was a buyer at the deadline, obviously. And like you said, Sonny Gray under the radar, but really just solid pitcher. Same thing with Kyle Bradish. He's probably the ace of the Orioles staff right now, which I wouldn't have said even a month or two ago. But just a really steady, consistent performer for him. And his bullpen, obviously, really good too. What about 75-ish points? Just really solid. But then as for Smell, it's tough because I think he still has a very, very outside shot at the playoffs because I beat Braxton last week. But it's going to be really tough for him to get in. But his team is still really solid. His pitching is really solid. 356 from him, including 91 from Freddie Peralta, a guy that's kind of been tossed around this year, team to team. Cody Senga, Dylan Cease had a really good bounce back week after his disastrous debut for El Paso. But then the bats, solid as well. MJ Melendez, 56 points. Just really solid overall. Altuve, who we brought at the deadline, 78 points. So, Smell, while he might not make the playoffs, has just a really solid team and a team that's going to be one to look out for next year.
Absolutely. Connor, what did you see in this matchup?
I do want to tip my cap to Smell. I think the loss against Bry the previous week took a lot of wind out of the Chihuahuas' sails for good reason, but this is also a relatively balanced team. There are a lot of deadline moves or pre-deadline to bring in more pitching, and there are just consistent performances across the board. Yusei Kikuchi, who consistency is not the first word that comes to mind with him. 27, Freddie Peralta, also a little bit inconsistent, 91. Cody Senga was 61 over a 2-start period. So I think the pitching is definitely there, and then the Chihuahuas have more prospects to get more, but some of the bats did kind of fall back down to earth. Chas McCormick had an ungodly 2-week stretch, and he only had 14 points and 13 at bats. Hunter Renfroe with 8 points is not what Smell was looking to acquire when he got him last month. And then for the hot rods, I think the main key word that Cody mentioned in his analysis was balance. There is just layers at every position. Gunnar Henderson has an off week, while Austin Riley comes back to true form with an 80 piece. Nolan Gorman injured, Christopher Morel can step in. Pete Alonso heated up very well. A lot of people get those guys. Spencer Steer with 46. There is a reason why Cody paid a great price to get him, and he's performed accordingly. So 459 points from the bats, and then Emerson Hancock comes up for a spot start against, I believe it, I forget who he actually started against, but 14 points for an initial start in the big leagues. Excellent. Clayton Kershaw's coming back. I think he's going to make a big performance in the playoffs. So And then the bullpen, just terrific show for the Hot Rods, complete showing last 2 weeks. And I think Cody's back to being one of the clear top 2 favorites for the title this year.
Yes. Okay, we will move on now to let's talk about Jamie's big win. The Tampa Tarpons take down the Clearwater Beach Dogs 782 to 623. Connor, I'll let you start with this one. What did you see in this matchup?
I think Jaime's performance is the most predictable thing ever. There was a little bit of a down week, or 2 of the last 3 weeks have been down, and the Bats come roaring back alive with 462 points. Bryce Harper still hasn't found the power stroke yet, but had 16 points. Brian Reynolds with 67 and Corey Seager with 51. That is just a crazy duo out of, I think, the utility spot for the most part. Brandon Lau had a decent showing as well, a recent trade acquisition. Freddie Freeman's been terrific after the All-Star break. And then the pitching besides Luis Severino has also looked good. Kenley Jansen had a 50 spot. That's just incredible for one reliever. Gavin Williams was 77, had back-to-back electric starts against the Blue Jays and another team who I'm blanking on, perhaps the White Sox. Lance Lynn's turned a corner since going to Los Angeles. And then for Hendog, I think a lot of people had confusion on what the Beach Dogs were doing during the deadline, and some of that regression is starting to show. Gary Sanchez with 11 at bats had 0 points. I think the Beach Dogs would have benefited from acquiring a catcher, even though the prices might have been a little bit high. Lane Thomas with 29 points and 22 at bats. I think that's a lower ratio than what Lane has done over the course of the year. Max Muncy with 37, Yandy Diaz, recent acquisition with 45, and the pitching barely eclipsed 300 points. That's not what we expect to see from a top 3 team. Spencer Strider with only 26, Max Scherzer with 38. So some solid performances, but the Beach Dogs did have a little bit of an underwhelming compared to some of the hot streak that they had in the previous weeks.
And Paul, what did you see with this matchup? Paul? Connor?
Sorry.
Oh,
No,
you're good.
sorry.
Were you?
I muted myself. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Thanks for saying something, or else I just kept going.
No.
So what I was saying that you guys couldn't hear, I think at this point in the season we can just predict what Jaime is going to do week to week, and that's score over 400 points with his bats and score probably a max of 300 points with his arms. And like Connor said, 50 out of Kenley Jansen's crazy, and it's not going to happen every week. So 300 is probably about right from his arms. And there's some good ones, obviously. Nola, Sale, Gavin Williams has been great this year. Bobby Miller, Gossman. So he's got good arms. It's just, they're not deep, and he doesn't get to 12 starts because he's limited in that area. But his bats are just insane, and if somebody has a down week like Bryce Harper, Bobby Witt's right there to pick him up. If Brandon Lau has 12 points, Ronald Acuna is there to pick him up. So, Jaime's bats are just crazy. We all know that. Can they stay crazy going into the playoffs? If they can, Jaime's a team that can beat anybody. But as for Hen, I said it last week. I didn't like what he did at the trade deadline. It sort of showed this week. 623 is a good performance, but obviously not good enough to beat a top team like Jaime's. So I think Hen has a little bit of worrying to do. There's nothing trade wise you can do at this point. You just kind of have to ride it out. But he still has good pieces there. It kind of, to me, it seems like he needs to ride his bats a little bit. guys like Jordan, who had a down week this week. Lane Thomas, who's fallen back to earth some. Juan Soto only has 15 points and 26 at bats. That's a down week. So, those guys need to perform in order for him to, keep his championship hopes alive. Remains to be seen if that will happen, though.
Yeah, there's probably 3 teams in this league, in my opinion, that could set their roster on Sunday night for the week and just let it ride for 7 days and score 700 points. I think that's probably John Haidt, Jamie, and myself. Now, if I manage my team really well, I can break 800. If John Haidt manages his team really well, he breaks 900. I'm curious to know where Jamie would fall if he, managed his team through the week. It's interesting here. He used 16 pitchers in this matchup. Hendog used 26. And Hendog's pitching outscored him by 1 point. I mean, the team is stacked. And I think we've said that on every podcast every week about Jaime's team. It's stacked. I'm curious to see if when we get into the playoffs and it's do or die, win or go home, is he, throughout the week working this team to keep up, with some of the teams that can put up, he put up 782 this week. There's probably 2 or 3 other teams that can do that. Can he, when he's playing them, manage his team and keep up with them? It's going to be interesting to see because, kind of what he does when we get into the playoffs. It's going to be very, very interesting to see. For Hendog, I think I got to echo kind of what you guys said. You got to be a little disappointed in what the Beach Dogs did at the deadline. I mean, at the end of the day, Hendog's team is great, and I know he knows that. And patience does pay off, and patience can work. But as Connor mentioned, clear hole at catcher. How much longer can you keep starting Orlando Arcia? Even if it is in a utility spot, how much longer can you keep running him out there? How much trust do you have in Lane Thomas? There's a lot of questions here that I think could have been addressed with his mass amount of prospects at the trade deadline. Maybe he wasn't comfortable with the prices. I don't know, but could that hold him back when we get to the playoffs? Hendog is going into these playoffs kind of on the exact opposite spectrum as my team. That's going to be really interesting to see as things even out because, Hendog's team is going to play better than this. I'm not sure I'm going to score 880 points every week. So I do believe there's some evening out to be done there. It's going to be really, really interesting to see kind of where both these teams go. And this matchup between them two was very important. Playoff seeding was definitely affected by this matchup. I think the Beach Dogs fell all the way to the 6th seed after losing this matchup. So, he's got a big Week 19 matchup against Bracton. You could make an argument it's a must-win for both teams, but definitely interesting to keep an eye on as we move forward and get closer and closer to the playoffs beginning. The next matchup we will go to. Let's give our boy Titus some love. Let's talk about the Nashville Sounds. 824 taking down Scott's Richmond Flying Squirrels, 824 to 496. Paul, I'll let you start here. What did you see in this matchup?
Yeah, so the 824 number obviously inflated by the no-hitter thrown this week. Michael Lorenzen for the Phillies. But still obviously a really good output, really good week this week from Tita. His 366 from his bats. He's got really good guys, obviously a little bit on the older side. But but still, this is a really good team and obviously a playoff team. Trying to see that there's not a whole lot of general weakness, I would say, because his arms are, consistent, good players, and his bats are probably the same. And that's kind of what you get when you get 28, 29, 30-year-old guys. You're not going to have the up and downs as much. So, really solid, but at the same time, I think there's some ceilings and limits on these guys. I don't know that you're going to get a 90-point week on any of these bats like you would like Pete Alonso or Gunnar Henderson for Cody. But still, it's a really consistent week, and if you have a younger player, younger team, and you have a down week, well, you're going to lose to Tita. So we'll see what happens in the playoffs, and we'll see what happens this week against me. But then for Scott and Richmond, 496, it's a little low, but his bats are decent, are really good. The 412 this week, that's crazy. That's a really high amount actually. And then his pitching, his starters were really, really bad this week. I'm not going to really sugarcoat that. He was kind of bailed out a little bit by his relief pitching, which combined for over 40 points of his 84. So, only 40-ish points from your starting pitching out of 9 starts. That's a tough number. But at the same time, he knows that pitching is a weakness for him. And if you have bats like this, if the deal is right in the offseason, because prices, in my experience at least, prices in the offseason are much different than prices during the season. So you never know. You might be able to get an arm or two for a bat or two. But it'll be an interesting offseason for Scott and Richmond.
And Connor, what's your thoughts with this matchup?
So, hats off to Tita. I think the Lorenzen no-hitter definitely helped, but there were some other solid pitching performances. Tony Gonsolin in a 2-start week had 45. That's nothing to laugh at. John Gray with 45. James Paxton with 28. He's continued to be a revelation for the Red Sox. Nick Pivetta, one of my least favorite pitchers, scored 27. So I think that's done well. Rizal Iglesias with 37. So 458 pitching points, and even slightly under 300 if you take out Lorenzen is definitely good. And then the bats look terrific. Whit Merrifield 46, Schwarber 48. The hits just keep coming for the Sounds. And then for Scott, I think Joey Meneses with 56. We've complimented the bats for 3 or 4 weeks now, and there's been good reason for that. 412 is just a very impressive amount. Francisco Alvarez continues to be one of the greatest young catchers in the game. Bryson Stott with 41. No doubt the pitching does need some improvements, but Scott knows that. One fact I do want to point out, I quickly scrolled through some of the history, and I think Paul mentioned that there's a ceiling to Tita's performance. Outside of a no-hitter, I don't think Tita scored 800 points this entire year in a standard week. While the 660s and 680s are solid performances that could do well in the playoffs, I don't know how that's going to match up against a Cody that could score in the high 700s, low 800s at any given week that tends to work well. So I'll be really interested to see how the Sounds do in the playoffs, but that is one sense of concern in Nashville.
Yeah, and for me, you look at Tita's team, and you almost have to say it's the anti-Lark team, right? I mean, the bats produce about the same, even though the ages are different. The age is the difference offensively between the two teams. And then when you look at the pitching, Tita's got just as many arms as Bragton does, but he's got all these 30-plus-year-old guys, and they consistent performances. You get 20 out of Maeda, 19 out of McCollum, 16 out of Gumby, 28 out of Paxton, 27 out of Pivetta. Just run them out there, let them do their thing, and you win matchups with that. So, maybe that's something that Bragton can kind of look at now that his offense is set. Can he kind of, maybe move off some younger arms land some of these more older, consistent arms because Tita's kind of put out the kind of way you do it. He's won all season with these arms, and it's worked really well for him. As for Scott, it's interesting this point total. Obviously the arms. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and just beat him over the head about his arms. He knows where his arms are at. He knows it's a problem, and he's got to fix it. Again, like I mentioned with Connor's team, you can't really fix your pitching overnight. That is the way arms are in this league. It's hard to get your hands on them. You have to take kind of the slow route to fix those. But I believe he's working on that. But as for the bats, a 412 point performance offensively, that's up there with I believe Connor was the leading offensive performer last week. And how many points did your offense have?
491 or something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, Scott's up there with the top dogs of the week offensively. And a little to kind of prove that, at the deadline, I had in my little home office upstairs, I had like a war room set up where I had like on this board all the teams I thought that would trade, that were sellers at the deadline, and the pieces that I was looking to get from their team. And I can remember at one point in the night, I took the dog out and I'd come back in and sat back down at the computer, and I'm looking at the board. And guys, I kid you not, I think I had 12 bats listed on that from the teams that I thought would be sellers that I was interested in getting, and like 8 of them were on Scott's team. And of course, I ended up getting 0 of them for a multitude of reasons. Scott doesn't. Scott's not getting rid of any of these guys cheaply. For one, and 2, we just kind of ran out of time. I know we talked Lars Nootbaar and Sal Frelick for the largest part of the night. But anyways, yeah, I mean the bats are there for him. A lot of these guys aren't really old. Bryson Stott, C.J. Abrams, Sal Frelick, Nootbaar, post Vertigo, Mountcastle looks like Barry Bonds. It's these are guys he can kind of build an offense around. Tristan Cassis has just really turned it on from a absolutely horrible April and May. I think in May he was hitting like 160 on the year. He's got that average up to 251. I think the future's bright. Scott knows what he's doing. He's going to get that team in the right direction. For Tita, again, like I said, it's all about just letting his consistent guys go. This team, we can talk all day about getting stars. Stars are hard to get, and they cost a whole heck of a lot. Tita went another route, and he has consistent players at every single position on his entire roster. And so while, I don't think this team can score as Connor mentioned, the 800-point weeks. Without, I know he did 824 here with a no-hitter, but on a without no-hitters or cycles, this team probably can't score 800. But when you play the Sounds, you're going to get a 650 plus performance out of that team, and that puts the pressure on you because a couple bad starts and suddenly you find yourself, wondering if you can even get to 600. So I think the Sounds are going to be tough to beat in the playoffs. They're not going to be an easy out by any means. So it's going to be definitely fun to watch going forward. Let's see. I think we have 2 more matchups to discuss. We will talk now about the Rocky Mountain Vibes, 619, taking down Dave's Red Wings, 619 to 409. Bry gets the win, 2 big wins in a row after kind of a lull there after the All-Star break for the Vibes. Paul, I'll let you jump in here. What did you see in this matchup?
Yeah, so Bry 619, a little bit low, I think, in my opinion, for him and for what he can do. But 383 up from his bats, always a good number when you're above that 300, 350 mark. Just 93 points out of Ozzy Albies. He just absolutely went crazy last week. But his arms also decent. He didn't. It looks like he didn't stream as much, at least not with relievers last week. He only played 3 relievers, so his bullpen, I guess, maybe is set, which would be just a massive update and massive development, I think, out of Rocky Mountain to have 3 relievers he's going to just roll with. Maybe a change in philosophy for the vibes. But for Dave, this was pretty much an all bats week, 318, and then only 91, less than 100 from his arms. And it's the same thing we said about Scott. It's the same thing we said about these underperforming and rebuilding teams. He's missing his arms, and it's not going to be easy to get arms, but at least he has an idea of where he can focus this offseason. And he has good prospects as well, guys that are in development that'll come up and be contributors for him. But at the end of the day, Riley Green's going to be a stud for him, a young stud. Torkelson as well, William Contreras from Milwaukee. So he's got long-term pieces if he so chooses. It's just getting those arms now for Dave.
Yeah, and before I turn it over to Connor, I want to say about the arms thing, and Paul, you mentioned it when we was talking about the last matchup. Prices are much different in the off-season than they are in season. And these teams that, Chad, who we haven't got to yet, but Connor, Dave, Scott, that's kind of all lacking in the pitching department. They've all, though, kind of built up a surplus of major league level bats, prospects and draft picks. It's going to be really interesting to see this offseason. You say, well, these contending teams don't want to move their pitchers. Well, they may want to. When that draft approaches and draft picks become even more valuable than they already are, it's going to be interesting if some guys are willing to cough up some of these arms. I know, like right now, it's so hard to get arms because you're concerned with death. The trade block was the trade deadline was coming. You had to get what you can get before this playoff run starts because of injuries and different things that happen. So there's teams rolling 13, 14 starting pitchers deep. I think in the offseason they're going to be willing to move some of these guys. So it's going to be really interesting to watch these teams that are starving for arms kind of all battle amongst each other, in what could be called the arms race off season. It's going to be really interesting to see. Connor, what did you see in this matchup?
So Cody mentioned that 1 or 2 bad starts could get you closer to 600, and that kind of is what Bry's team literally did. Bo Brisky -2, Seth Lugo -5, Jesus Luzardo -16. Those are performances that hampered the vibes, and I know that team has quite a lot of injuries. Josh Naylor at first base, so Joey Votto was, I think, the primary first baseman during this week. Luis Robert's had some injuries. Ozzy Albies is now on the injured list. So definitely some injury concerns for the Vibes, but they just stuck it out. Braxton Garrett with 26. He's continued to be a revelation. Andres Jimenez with 59. Julio Urias with 82. He was greatly struggling to begin the year, but now has seemed to find his groove. And then the relief pitching was definitely solid as well. So I think for Bry, there's a lot of good and bad for this matchup, and it'll be interesting to see how he finishes the last week. And then for Dave, I don't know what else there is to add. Patrick Corbin's been fine. Kyle Hendricks could definitely move to a contender. JP Sears, I know Brackton and I are big fans of, so maybe he could either be part of the future pitching staff for the Red Wings or be moved for more draft picks. Clark Schmidt, 29 points. That was a good ad given the recent Yankees injuries. So 91 points from the pitchers. No need to beat a dead horse with it. But I think there is a lot of optimism in Rochester.
Yeah, Bry has definitely kind of shared being frustrated, with his team's performance the last couple of weeks, and you almost have to, those frustrations you get them. I mean, he finally gets his Stewie Ruiz back. and Ozzie goes on the IL. And that is a tough break because, as Paul mentioned, Albies has been insane recently. Me and Paul were actually having a conversation the other night when we both learned that Ozzie Albies has got 28 home runs on the year. I've been watching Braves games all year, and I had no idea he had 28 home runs. I mean, he's been an absolute beast at second base, and to lose him with a hamstring injury, which we all know can be kind of tricky to come back from, it's definitely tough. And Connor kind of touched on just 236 points from a Bry pitching. That's just not something we see week to week. I know he's happy to get the win, but I think this team is almost kind of in hen territory. Maybe they're getting the bad baseball out before the playoffs start. I'm sure that's what Bry's wanting. But yeah, he's got to get some things right here, or he wants to get some things right here before the playoffs begin. And for Dave, he just kind of falls into the same category of the rebuilding teams we've talked about. Some decent offensive performances here. He finished with 318 offensive points on the week, but again, just no pitching production whatsoever. And it was the difference in the matchup. So again, as I mentioned, the arms race this offseason, man, there's going to be a lot of teams wanting arms. There's going to be a lot of teams that's got arms that I think can be enticed to move them, especially as our draft approaches. So we will move on now to the last matchup of the week. The Hartford Yard Goats take down Chad's Oklahoma City Dodgers 765 to 395. Connor, I'll let you jump in here. What did you see with this matchup?
Well, through Wednesday, I think this was honestly the most entertaining matchup because the Dodgers looked terrific against the Yard Goats, which was definitely a change of pace from when we thought Hartford might double the points of Oklahoma City. Luke Weaver with 27. Cole Reagans has done terrific since moving to Kansas City. So I think that was a really smart, low-key acquisition from Chad before the deadline. 192 pitching points for a team that really doesn't, I don't want to say care, but he's looking for the future most certainly, is definitely a good showing. And then there are a couple bat pieces sprinkled here and there. Honestly, 203 points is a little bit of a down week from what we've seen for the Dodgers, but I think that's completely fine. Gabriel Ruiz with 54 is one highlight. And then for the Yard Goats, 765 in a down week. Matt Olson with 102. Aaron Judge with 56. Otani only had 84, but 489 offensive points is crazy. And then the pitching staff is good enough to get 276 points even after a couple rough outings from the pitching squad. So I think if this is the worst the Yard Goats can do, there's a lot of fright to be had in the playoffs from the other six teams. But
Absolutely. And Paul, what did you see with this matchup?
Yeah, I mean, Max Fried and Corbin Burns combined for 11 points, and he still dropped 765. That's going to be tough. It's going to be tough to go against because if that team fires on all cylinders, it's lights out. And plus, his bullpen a little bit lower than normal. It looks like 50 combined points from his bullpen. John Haight's been averaging this year between 70 and 80 from his bullpen. So he easily could have, if they were firing on all cylinders, he could have doubled up Chad here. But as for Chad, looking at his team, it's already been said. Cole Reagans has been a revelation this year. Really solid these last few starts. Can he keep it up? Time will tell. Is he going to be a guy that Chad can rely on going forward? Remains to be seen. But his bats really kind of laid an egg this week. Only 203 points from the bats. Which is tough. It's tough when you don't have the bats or the arms. It's going to be really tough to compete. And, obviously he has good bats. They just underperformed this week. So we'll see where Chad kind of goes. Trying to see. There was one player I wanted to. Luis Matos, I guess, got sent down today. which in Chad's spot, only this week left to compete. Not going to make a huge difference since likely next year he'll be up to start the season on opening day. But it's going to be an interesting offseason for Chad, I think. So there's one more thing I wanted to say with Hen too. Oh, Shohei Ohtani, 84 points. That's your weekly Shohei Ohtani update.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, so for we've maybe not we, it's just been me. I've been kind of ribbing John Hyde a little on Maine this week, talking about how the yard goats have been exposed a little bit. Here's what has been exposed, and Connor kind of touched on it. In order to beat John Hyde, you need him to have a down week like this, and you need your team to fire on all cylinders and have the best possible week they have. That's the bottom line. That's what it's going to take to beat him. Probably rare that happens. So, the 489 points offensively, that's what John Hyde's done all year. Be around that 460 to 550 kind of in between right there offensively. But pitching wise, 276 points. I know he's definitely disappointed in that. That is when his team is beatable. If his arms do this in the playoffs, John Hyde can be beat. Obviously, they have not done that a lot this year. It's very rare that this has happened. Garrett Cole, 2-start week, 30 points. That's definitely down. Max Fried, 5 points. Corbin Burns, 6 points. Some negative streams here that aren't great. Framber Valdez, 5 points. So, yeah, I mean, listen, he scored 760 points in a down week. I mean, that's what this team is capable of doing. But I know that he's hoping to right the pitching woes before the playoffs begin. And for Chad, I mean, same story. The one thing I'll say, I think Connor did mention it. You got to give Chad a shout out. I guess there's a moral victory to be had. I think by Wednesday evening, John Hyde was probably actually a little nervous. Of course, that changed pretty quickly going into Thursday, and he kind of took over the matchup and ended up winning by nearly 400 points. But yeah, Chad is just setting lineups and counting draft picks at this point. He's ready. He's ready for draft day. That's Chad's Super Bowl. So that's what he's waiting on. So yeah, but for John Hyde, hey, down week, you survive, you win. You just need to kind of identify where your weaknesses are, and I mean at this point, really just hope for good luck. He's got to get the pitching woes under control because I do think 276 points by the pitchers in the playoffs. Listen, you're going to be playing good teams. You could slip up and get beat. So definitely interesting to see. And that will conclude the Week 18 matchups. As we've mentioned already in the podcast, there were no trades to discuss, which is almost kind of sad that deals are done. But we will just jump right into the Week 19 matchups. And looking around here, definitely some interesting matchups. The first one I want to go to is going to be, let's go with Clearwater Beach Dogs versus the Bismarck Larks. Paul, I'll let you start here. How do you see this matchup going this week?
Well, I have a clear rooting interest this week. So I believe the playoff scenario works itself out to where if I beat Tita, I'm in. I need no other help. But if I lose to Tita, then I would need Hendog to beat Bracton for me to advance. So I'm obviously rooting for Hendog this week. Apologies to Bracton, but I think if the situation was reversed, he would do the same. In fact, the situation is reversed, and I'm sure he is rooting for Tita against me. But I also think Hendog is going to win this week. It looks like Bracton has his lineup set for the week. He'll get to 12 starts, and he's still projected for about 500 points. I think he'll be over that. I think they're lowballing him just a little bit on his point production. But I'm still not entirely sure that he's going to crack 600. And I do believe that Hendog, while I'm, it's been vocalized and been noted that I wasn't a big fan of what he did at the deadline, that he'll still be a consistent 600 point scorer. And should he do that, I think he will get the win this week.
And Connor, what do you see with this matchup?
Yeah, I think with this matchup, there is a sense of urgency from Hen. So I think the Beach Dogs are giving the Larks all they can. And on the first day, Max Scherzer has a 53-point start. So that's definitely good for both the Beach Dogs and for the Tides. So I think Hen is going to win this, but I think Brackton is going to outperform the projections.
Yeah, it definitely an interesting matchup. And I know that Brackton's playoff hopes are on the line, but there's a lot on the line for Hendog too. If he wins this week and John Haidt beats Jamie, maybe Paul beats Tita, there's some playoff seeding that gets moved around here for him that could help Hendog help him climb that ladder in the seeding aspect of this. I'm going to agree with both of you guys. I just think the Beach Dogs are a much, much better team. I think the pitching is definitely better, and I think that's the difference in the matchup. So I do think it's going to be closer than what I think Fantrax has it as like a 200-point differential. I'm going to be a little bit closer than that. I think it's just going to be about a 75 to 80-point game, but I'm going to give the advantage to the Beach Dogs. Ending the year on a high note. So we will move on now. Let's talk about, let's jump into the Norfolk Tides versus the Nashville Sounds. Paul, I'm going to make you go last on this one. Connor, I'll let you go. How do you see this matchup going?
I mean, I think this is probably the matchup of the week. There are a lot of playoff implications for seeding, obviously. The Sounds appear off to a good start currently with 9 points, but I do think that I'm actually going to call an upset here. I think Paul is going to pull this off. There's just more to play for at this point, and I think Paul made some really sneaky good moves at the deadline. Xander Bogaerts is just a consistent hitter. Julio Rodriguez appears back to form. The first start of the period, Chris Flexen with 16 points. That's more than he's done previously since signing with the Rockies. And then for the Sounds, I think it is going to be a consistent 600-point outing, but I just think that Norfolk has too much going and too much motive to let the Sounds beat them. So this is going to be a convincing one, but I think Paul's going to pull it out.
Yeah, for me, I think I'm probably gonna agree with Fantrax here in regard to the closeness of this matchup. Fantrax has the Nashville Sounds winning 664 to 636, about a 28 point differential there. I think, and I'm sure this is the last thing Paul wants to hear because he's had so many of these this week. I could see this matchup being down to less than 10 points, kind of a Sunday night deal. I'm gonna go Tides too. I'm gonna go Tides here. I think Paul just really did what he needed to do at the deadline to kind of position this team. He's had 2 weeks in a row where he surpassed 700 points. And I don't see any reason he can't get there or at least close to it this week. And I think Tita is going to be right around the 660, 680 mark. It's going to be really tight, but I think the Tides are going to be working the wire, making sure they get to 12 starts, doing all the thing, using every roster spot he's got. I think this week's really important, and I think Paul can find a way to get a win this week and clinch the 7th seed. Paul, you go. What do you see in this matchup?
Well, so you guys have put me in quite a position here because I came in here ready to not pick me. And I'm going to continue and not pick me. I'm going to pick Tita this week.
Okay.
And this, I'll tell you why. Coming into this week, I have, of my normal starters, 0 of them are on 2-start weeks. I had to pick up, as Connor mentioned, I had to pick up Chris Flexen tonight on just a wing and a prayer. I mean, he got 16 points for me, which is massive. But then I picked up Ty Black to start tomorrow, another Colorado pitcher starting at home against a decent team in Arizona. So, I'm scraping anything and everything I can scrape just to get even 10 starts. And I like my bats, but they'll probably just be in the 350-ish range. That's hopeful. And if I just have, one or two of my normal starters if they have bad starts this week, I'm just sunk. And then I've talked about Tita's team, how consistent they are. I know Tita's going to drop 650 on me this week. I know most likely it's not going to be 700, but I also know most likely it's not going to be 600. So it's going to be an uphill battle. I'm going to scrounge and claw and dig for every point I can find, but I'm just not sure it's going to be enough.
Yes, yeah, it's definitely going to be this matchup, the Tides and the Sounds, and the Beach Dogs and the Larks. I mean, just so many implications between those two matchups. It's really, really, really going to be interesting to watch. We will move on to another one matchup that does have some playoff implications here. The Tampa Tarpons take on the Hartford Yard Goats. For me, it's really interesting because John Haight's sitting at 18-0, and you got to wonder kind of the predicament he's in. I mean, it's almost eerie to go into the playoffs unbeaten, right? You just kind of feel like that's bad luck. Like I've went in, been perfect all year, and then boom, I'm going to lose. But this is hey, he's playing a good team. It's really going to be interesting to see if Jamie can pull the upset this week. For me, I don't think he can, from the aspect of John Haidt doesn't care if he's playing Chad or if he's playing me or if his team has 1,100 points by Wednesday or if his team has 150 points by Wednesday. He is going to be managing every single day, working his available roster spots, streaming where he can stream, filling holes, doing what he needs to do to win. And Jamie just doesn't do that. So while Jamie's going to set his lineup and sit on it and probably score 750 points, I just don't think it'll be enough to take down the Yard Goats, who's already put up 156 points on Monday. So I do think John Haidt is going to kind of cap off the perfect regular season and go in the playoffs 19-0. Paul, what do you think with this matchup?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you that he's going to be 19-0. John Haidt is. I think he'll be over 800, and I don't think Jaime can score 800, just given the current makeup of his roster, and that he's probably he might get to 11, 12 starts, but I just don't see how he's going to be able to make up the difference in talent, just overall top to bottom, roster to roster. So I'm trying to see here if there's any notable starters that he has with 2-start weeks. Doesn't really look like it. So I'll stick with John Haidt going undefeated this year.
And Connor, what do you see with this matchup?
Height's going to be undefeated this year. I think in previous weeks you're getting a lot of credit to his managing, even though he has an overpowering team and he's already streamed Jake Myers. So I think that's an early indication that the streams you're using to every roster slot possible is going to come to life here. Max Fried, Merrill Kelly, and Fromber Valdez have already scored a combined 75 points. So that's going to be a tough hole for the Tarpons to climb out of. And I just don't think we've consistently seen Jaime work the waiver wire or manage the way that needs to be kept up with the yard goats. So Fantrax currently has it as 844 to 673. I think both teams are going to outscore that, but there's going to be an 150 plus point difference in the yard goats' favor.
Yes. And moving on now, we will go to the Rocky Mountain Vibe as Bry takes on Chad's Oklahoma City Dodgers. And Paul, I'll let you go. How do you see this matchup going?
Yeah, so it's an important week for Bry to either maintain or possibly improve his playoff seeding. And I think he'll do just that by taking down Chad, who's, as I think you said it before, Cody, he's just counting the days until February comes for the draft, the prospect draft. Bry's team's really talented, and it's really going to be tough to beat if he's firing all cylinders. Like I said before, I'm not sure if he's doing his streaming as much now with his pitching, or if he's just rolling with what he's got in his bullpen. I guess we'll see this week, but there's just way too much talent there, I think, to I know it's as of 11-12 on Monday night. It's a 50-50 tie, but I think Bryce Town's going to pull away.
And Connor, how do you see this matchup going?
I'm going to boil this down to two key numbers. Bry hasn't always been happy with his team's recent performance, and I think the Vibes are going to need to score at least like 575 or 600 points despite the injuries to prove that the team can make some noise in the playoffs. And initially, 50 points on Monday, that's not too great, but there's room for improvement there. And then for Chad, the big number is 171 because that is the number of days from now until the 2024 first year player draft. So I think just the motive is there for Brian. And I know Chad is a terrific manager, but I think just given these directions of the team, there's no way the Vibes don't pull this out. And Fantrax currently has it as an 120 point matchup.
Yeah. Again, I'll be quick here. I think these are just two teams in two different directions. I think Bry, albeit has been disappointed, dealing with some tough injuries recently. I think he comfortably will pull out the win and go into the playoffs on a high note. So we will move on now to let's go Homco's Cannonballers versus Dave's Red Wings. This matchup's probably a whole lot more interesting. There's zero implications here in the Week 19 matchup. But I think both teams are pretty even at this point in the season, with Homco doing a little selling. But again, I still think Homco has, although he's had a very tough season, I still think there's talent there. And I think that he can kind of finish the season on a high note and get another win. I'm going to give the advantage to the Cannonballers. Paul, what do you think here?
I'll also favor Homco in this matchup, although David looks like has set his roster, and his point total is going to be low, and he knows that. But if he's over 550, if that's where he kind of hovers, this will be a close matchup. I know it's nearly the end of day one. He's not even at 0. He's -1 right now. He only had, I think, 2 bats going today, and one of them was McCutcheon, who got scratched. So obviously going to be a slow start to the week for Dave, but he's going to get going. Tough start against him with Brady Singer tonight, doing pretty well against Seattle. So Homco's off to a pretty good start, but I'll take Homco. But this should be a matchup where both teams end up in the mid to high 500s.
And Connor, what do you see in this matchup?
Homco scored almost identically 1,000 points more than Dave has this year, and the Cannonballers had an uncharacteristically tough week last week. I think there's every incentive for the Cannonballers to finish strong and prove that they are going to be a playoff-worthy team in 2024. So that's all I have to say about it.
Okay, and moving on now, we will go to the El Paso Chihuahuas versus Scott's Richmond Flying Squirrels. Paul, I'll let you have first shot at this one. How do you see this matchup going?
Yeah, so it's closed out the season for Scott and Richmond. I'll be interested to see if his bats can continue the tear that they've been on. Um, Ryan Mountcastle, see what he can do. Newt Barr, who you had talked about, Cody, as couldn't get it sneak it in at the deadline. But still an interesting building block piece potentially for Scott. And then for Smell, it's still relatively theoretically possible, I guess, to make the playoffs. Not very likely, I don't believe. But I still think Smell's going to get the win this week. Finish strong for the season. And then head into this off season and next season as an easily potential playoff team.
And Connor, how do you see this matchup going?
I think the scouts are going to be out in Richmond. I think Scott's team has a lot of interesting young outfielders, just talent in general. So the main point is going to be to see what the roster vision is for next year. Since Mel has a outside shot at making the playoffs, I think the Chihuahuas are going to end it with a bang and do their best they can to sneak in. And even if not, I think it was a valiant effort for the Chihuahuas to buy when they did. But yeah, I think there's an 100-point difference on Fantrax. I think this discrepancy is going to be even further, but I do want to give Scott a ton of credit for taking over a tougher team and really showing the bats out and just overperforming with the roster in general.
Yeah, for me, I'm gonna give the advantage to Smell here. Definitely a playoff worthy team. Been in it all year. For most of the year. This is a good team. Scored 700 points on me last week, or close to it. That's just the kind of production this team can put up on a weekly basis. And I just don't think Scott's quite there in the pitching department. So I'm going to give the advantage to Smell and the Chihuahuas. I think they, in the season 8-11, which could be tied with Braxton and Paul if they both lose, but I just don't think you would have any of the tiebreakers there. I'm not sure how all that would shake out, but I do think Smell gets the win and finishes the year on a high note. And we will move on to the last matchup of the week. The Amarillo Sod Poodles take on the Bowling Green Hot Rods. Paul, I'll let you go first. How do you see this matchup going?
Yeah, so this will be an interesting one. I don't think necessarily the score at the end of the week will be interesting. I believe Cody will win fairly handily, but it's going to be an interesting last week for Connor, just to see what he can put up point wise. I mean, it was mentioned before, and it's been mentioned, in the last week or two on the last couple podcasts. Josh Bell was the man nobody wanted this year. I had him, and I couldn't give him away. And then Connor came calling, and I pretty much gave him away to Connor. And then Connor was trying to sell him, and nobody wanted him. And yet here he is. He already tonight he hit a home run. He has 15 points. Key Brian Hayes, another guy, I essentially gave him away to Connor at the deadline because I need the roster spot. And he just went on an absolute tear last week. Has 9 points again tonight. So at the end of the day, this week is about Connor kind of seeing what he has, taking stock, taking notes with what he's got. So that it'll be interesting from that angle. But then for Cody, the main storyline I think for Cody, and he knows it, is Wander Franco. We're all aware, I think, at this point of what's going on with him. It doesn't seem, at least like for at least this week in this matchup, that Wander Franco will be available to Cody. And it'll be worth bearing and noting what his availability will be for the rest of this season and for the rest of his career potentially. So So that's kind of his main focus, I would think, going into this week and going into the playoffs. Obviously, Cody has done a great job of building his team that were Franco to miss the rest of this season. He's built enough depth at shortstop to handle it. But it's still, you're losing a 900 to 1,000 point bat. It's going to be really tough to replace and to replicate that production. But if there's any team in this entire league, I think, that can handle losing somebody like that, it probably is Cody's team. But it'll still, be worth noting and monitoring as we close out the season.
And Connor, what's your thoughts with this matchup?
Do we have to talk about this matchup? In all seriousness, I think the final score is not going to be close, but I think last week my offense had a really good week and 75 points when Wilson Contreras. Let's see here. I think it's 67 points from the offense when Wilson Contreras only had 2 at bats, and Jake McCarthy, who is the face of my Discord, got sent down, is a very good start. So I think if the pitching can have a couple of good gems, I currently have 3 pitchers that are on rehab or are currently in the minors, so I'll be monitoring if they could be in the mix for next year, and then just seeing what bats could be part of my future or could be attractive to other clubs. And then for Cody, I think Gunnar Henderson is a replacement shortstop along with Ezekiel Tovar. I don't think this team's going to miss too much of a beat on, obviously, Wander Franco hurts, but I think the Hot Rods are going to still have a very tough showing and strike a lot of fear into other teams' hearts going into the playoffs.
Excuse me. Y'all got me choked up about Wander. Really this week is more about me just trying to keep the consistency I've had the last 2 weeks, topping over 800 points. Almost every week I basically just play John Hyde in my mind. I'm trying to outscore him. That's the goal, right? Get into the playoffs and somehow beat John Hyde. So, that's my focus this week. Right now, after Monday, we've got it down. He's at 156. I'm at 154. We'll see kind of how the rest of the week goes. As for Wander Franco, the whole thing is brutal. Yes, I've got the depth to replace him. Yes, I can probably, cover it and not be hurt that bad this year. But probably my most untouchable bat. Probably, to me, my most valuable bat. And I could be looking at losing the guy depending on what comes out in the coming days for his career. I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know what's going to happen. It sucks. It definitely sucks. But, yeah, I'll just try to stay the course. I've got depth. I've kind of prepared for injuries, not necessarily child molestation allegations, but injuries nonetheless. So I'll piece it together and we'll see kind of what happens moving forward. But definitely tough this week, and definitely this week. And as more news comes out, nothing really positive is coming out anymore. So we'll see what happens. We'll see. Where that goes. But yeah, Connor broke 600 last week. Man, I hope he does it again. Hope he has a strong week to end the year and kind of positions himself where he wants to be going into the off season. And for me, I'm just looking to kind of stay consistent to where I've been, complete performances. So whether I face Paul or Bracton in the playoffs, I'm kind of rolling in, feeling good about where my team is. So that will conclude this week's edition of the Base on Balls podcast. I'll give everybody a chance for some final words. Connor, is there anything you want to add as we go into the final week of the regular season?
So I can't wait to hear Cody, Paul, and Bracton's state of the league at the end of the season. But just from the penultimate week of the regular season, the lowest score was 395 points with Chad, and the vast majority of teams were in the 500s, if not above. I think that just speaks to how competitive the league is, even though so many playoff seeds have already been decided, or at least we have a general idea of out of the 14 what three teams are really vying for the last spot and what some of the positioning might be. So I think a lot of teams are going to look forward to scouting what they need to do in the offseason. But this last week, with there still being a playoff spot in the balance, is really going to be exciting.
And Paul, any last words?
Yeah, it's down to it. I had said last week that or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, that my playoff run kind of starts then. I'm 1-0 since it started, and ideally I go 2-0 this week, and then I roll into the playoffs, and we'll see what happens from there. It's one and done at that point. But obviously, aside from me and aside from my matchup with Tita, it's just been a really good year this year. And I know it's not over, but I'm really proud of kind of where this league has gone and the direction it's taken. And, I look forward to getting into the off season, chopping it up, getting some deals done potentially. Um, and obviously the hockey league and obviously the football league. But baseball is kind of where my heart is. It's my favorite sport, and it's my favorite fantasy sport. So it's been a lot of fun this year. Win, lose, or draw this week. It's been great, and I kind of look forward to seeing where we go from here and seeing how we can just keep evolving this league.
Yeah, I got to echo what both of y'all said. I mean, the league is just in an absolutely terrific spot. Competitiveness all across the board from 1 to 14. Really going to be an interesting week, kind of watching these playoff seeds get settled. I know it's kind of it takes a little sting out when you can't trade, right? You want to trade for so many reasons. Wander Franco gets suspended. I'd love to go out and overpay for some high end bat to kind of take the brunt of that out. And Paul kind of mentioned earlier about kind of scratching and clawing and picking up Chris Flexen, and it gets tough when you can't trade for arms, to get to 12 for the week. So you kind of just have to make it work the best you can. But also too, man, can you imagine how much is going to pop off when we turn trading back on? It's going to be pretty interesting to see kind of where that goes. But first, we've got a league championship to decide. Really, really strong teams all across the board. John Haight's got to be the consensus favorite. But I do think that if you get in, you got a chance. The one and done, our playoffs aren't very long. For instance, Paul Bracton's going to be the 7th seed. That means they're 3 wins away from a championship. I'm the 2nd seed. I'm 3 wins away from a championship. So getting hot at the right time or getting cold at the right time can make all the difference in the world. So it's going to be really interesting to see as we kind of navigating all the focuses off of trades and on the playoffs. And going to be a lot of fun to watch. So that will wrap things up tonight for the Week 18 edition of the Base on Balls podcast. It's been a lot of fun. Tune in next week as we will know the results of the playoffs and we will preview the round 1 of the playoff matchups. Thank you all for listening.